Miriam is a short story by Truman Capote. In it, we see a woman meet a very odd child and begin to lose her touch with reality and her sense of self. In the story, the first character we meet is Miriam Miller, referred to as Mrs. Miller throughout the duration of the story. She's a widow and doesn't have any friends or family. She isn't really noticed by the others in her apartment building, and she kind of just lives her life ignored by most people. She is, for all intents and purposes, practically invisible to the world around her. Her interests were narrow, she had no friends to speak of, and she rarely journeyed farther than the corner grocery. The other people in the house never seemed to notice her. Her clothes were a matter of fact, her hair iron gray, clipped and casually waved. She did not use cosmetics. Her features were plain and inconspicuous, and on her last birthday she was 61. The next character we meet is Miriam, an odd little girl with the same name as Miss Miller. Miller meets her when she goes to the movies, and Miriam is without any parent or guardian. The line seemed to be taking its own time, and looking for some distraction, she suddenly became conscious of a little girl standing under the edge of the marquee. Her hair was the longest and strangest Miss Miller had ever seen, absolutely silver white, like an albino's. It flowed waist-length in smooth, loose lines. She was thin and fragilely constructed. There was a simple, special elegance to the way she stood, with her thumbs in the pockets of her tailored plum velvet coat. The girl eventually walks up to Miss Miller, asking Miller to buy her a ticket. Miller introduces herself and seems concerned about why a child is at the theater alone. However, when asked, Miriam gives no response. Miriam then states her name after Miller asks for it, and then Miller remarks on how both their names are the same. Later that afternoon, Miriam appears at Miller's apartment, despite having no way to know where she lives. She was reading the Times when the doorbell rang. At first she thought it must be a mistake, and whoever it is would go away, but it rang and rang and rang and settled into a persistent buzz. She looked at the clock, a little after 11. It did not seem possible. She was always asleep by 10. Climbing out of the bed, she trotted barefoot across the living room. "I'm coming, please be patient." The latch was caught. She turned it this way, and the bell never paused an instant. "Stop it," she cried. The bolt gave way, and she opened the door an inch. "What in heaven's name?" "Hello," said Miriam. "Oh, why hello," said Miss Miller, stepping hesitantly into the hall. "You're that little girl." Miller then lets Miriam into the apartment, and Miriam mentions how she likes her place, and Miller responds by asking what she wants. Miriam just dodges the question and asks Miller to sit down. Miller then asks a different question of how Miriam knew where she lived, to which, again, Miriam dodges the question. She asks if she can hear Miller's canary sing. However, Miller says no, after which Miller asks for food, specifically sandwiches. Miller grants this, however, with the condition that Miriam must leave once she's eaten. Miriam complains, saying that it's cold and dark outside, to which Miller says that Miriam shouldn't have come to her apartment to begin with. Miriam then somehow gets the canary to start singing, despite the canary's cage still having the night cover on. Miriam then proceeds to demand the jewel that Miller has, to which, for some reason, Miller cannot resist. She carried the food on a tray and set it on the coffee table. She saw first that the birdcage still wore its night cover, and Tommy was singing. It gave her a queer sensation, and no one was in the room. Miss Miller went through an alcove leading to her bedroom. At the door she caught her breath. "What are you doing?" she asked. Miriam glanced up, and in her eyes there was a look that was not ordinary. She was standing by the bureau, a jewel case open before her. For a minute she studied Miss Miller, forcing their eyes to meet, and she smiled. "There's nothing good here," she said, "but I like this." Her hand held a cameo brooch. "It's charming." "Perhaps you better put it back," said Miss Miller, feeling suddenly the need of some support. She leaned against the doorframe. Her head was unbearably heavy, and pressure rated the rhythm of her heartbeat. The light seemed to flutter defectively. "Please, child, a gift from my husband." "But it's beautiful, and I want it," said Miriam. "Give it to me." As she stood, striving to shape a sentence which would somehow save the brooch, it came to Miss Miller that there was no one to whom she might turn. She was alone, a fact that had not been among her thoughts for a long time. Its sheer emphasis was stunning. But here in her own room, in the hushed snow city, were evidences she could not ignore, or, she knew with startling clarity, resist. Miriam eventually finishes the sandwich that Miller had prepared for her, then asks for dessert, specifically asking for almond cake and cherries. Miller just responds by stating that Miriam promised to leave once she ate the sandwiches, to which Miriam has seemed to forgot. Miriam makes one final request before leaving, to kiss her goodnight. Miller refuses, saying, "Please, I'd rather not." This prompts Miriam to smash Miller's flower vase. Miller then feels sick the next day and has an odd dream. A small girl wearing a bridal gown and a wreath of leaves led a great procession down a mountain path, and among them were unusual silence till a woman at the rear asked, "Where is she taking us?" "No one knows," said an old man marching in front. "But isn't she pretty?" volunteered a third voice. "Isn't she like a frost flower, so shining and white?" The day after that, she felt better and went out to eat breakfast, then decided to go do some shopping. When she was waiting on the street, she noticed an old man and exchanged a smile with them. However, as the story says, there was nothing friendly about the smile. It was merely two cold flickers of recognition. Miller eventually crossed the street and stepped in the middle of the block to face the old man. He also stopped and coated his head, grinning. Miller eventually got to the florist's shop, and the old man passed by and tipped his hat at her. Miller then bought some new flowers, a new vase, and bought 6 almond cakes and a cherry, which happened to be the same desserts that Miriam was asking for. After she was done shopping, Miriam went home. At precisely 5, the doorbell rang. Miss Miller knew who it was. The hem of her housecoat trailed as she crossed the floor. "Is that you?" she called. "Naturally," said Miriam. A word resounding shrilly from the hall. "Open this door." "Go away," said Miss Miller. "Please hurry, I have a heavy package." "Go away," said Miss Miller. She returned to the living room, lighted a cigarette, sat down, and calmly listened to the buzzer, on and on and on. "Might as well leave. I have no intention of letting you in." Shortly the bell stopped. For possibly 10 minutes Miss Miller could not move. Then, hearing those sounds, she concluded that Miriam had gone. She tiptoed to the door and opened it a sliver. Miriam was half reclining atop a cardboard box with a beautiful French doll cradled on her arms. "Really, I thought you were never coming," she said peevishly. "Here, help me get this in. It's awfully heavy." Miller then let Miriam in out of curious passivity, despite declaring that she had no intention of doing so. She opened the box that Miriam brought, and it was filled with clothes. Miriam explained that she had come to live with Miller, and then thanked Miller for buying the cherries. Miller was very opposed to the idea and quickly responded, "But you can't, for God's sake, go away and leave me alone." But Miriam just completely ignored her and mentioned how generous Miller was for getting the roses and almond cakes. Then went on to talk about how she used to love the poor old man. She then asked where to put her things, and Miller began to cry, and backed off to the door. Miss Miller's face dissolved into a mask of ugly red lines. She began to cry, and there was an unnatural, tearless sort of weeping, as though, not having wept for a long time, she had forgotten how. Carefully she edged backwards till she touched the door. She fumbled through the hall and down the stairs to a landing below. She pounded frantically on the door of the first apartment she came to. A short, red-headed man answered, and she pushed past him. "Say, what the hell is this?" he said. "Anything wrong, lover?" asked the young woman who appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands. And it was to her that Miss Miller turned. "Listen," she cried, "I'm ashamed of behaving this way, but, well, I'm Miss H.T. Miller, and I live upstairs," and she pressed her hands all over her face. "It sounds so absurd." The woman guided her to a chair, while the man excitedly rattled pockets. Miller then went on to explain to the woman about Miriam, that there was a girl visiting her that she didn't know, and that she had stolen things, and that she didn't want to be anywhere near her. The woman told her that what she should have done was to call a cop. The man went to enter the room and found that there was no one there. Presently they heard the man on the stairs. He strode into the room, frowning and scratching the back of his neck. "Nobody there," he said, honestly embarrassed. "She must have beat it." "Harry, you're a jerk," announced the woman. "We've been sitting here the whole time, and you would have seen." She stopped abruptly, for the man's glance was sharp. "I looked all over," he said, "and there just ain't anybody there. Nobody, understand?" "Tell me," said Miss Miller, rising. "Tell me, did you see a large box or a doll?" "No, ma'am, I didn't." And the woman, as if delivering a verdict, "No, for crying out loud." Miriam seemed to be gone. Miller returned to her apartment. Nothing was changed, and everything was in place. However, she described it as if it was empty. Emptier than if the furnishings and familiars were not present, lifeless and petrified as a funeral parlor. She looked around and realized that the box had disappeared. Miriam had disappeared too. She sat in a chair, and things just weren't as they seemed. The room was losing shape, and it was dark and getting darker, and there was nothing to be done about it. She could not lift her hand to light a lamp. Suddenly, closing her eyes, she felt an upward surge, like a diver emerging from some deeper, greener depths. In times of terror or immense distress, there are moments when the mind waits, as though for a revelation, while a skein of calm is woven over thought. It is like a sleep or a supernatural trance, and during this lull, one is aware of the force of quiet reasoning. Oh, what if she had never really known a girl named Miriam, that she had been foolishly frightened on the street? In the end, like everything else, it was of no importance. For the only thing she had lost to Miriam was her identity. But now she knew she had found again the person who lived in this room, who cooked her own meals, who owned the canary, who was someone she could trust and believe in. Mrs. H.T. Miller. Listening in contentment, she became aware of a double sound, a bureau opening and closing. She seemed to hear it after a completion opening and closing. Then gradually the harshness of it was replaced by the murmur of a silk dress, and this, delicately faint, was moving nearer and swelling in intensity till the walls trembled with a vibration and the room was quivering under a wave of whispers. Mrs. Miller stiffened and opened her eyes to a dull, direct stare. "Hello," said Miriam. So, what did that story mean, though? Well, there are many interpretations. One theory that seems to describe the story well is that Mrs. Miller is a schizophrenic and that Miriam is just an illusion created by her mind. One thing that points to this is the fact that, well, nobody else seems to acknowledge Miriam's existence. In the story, it states that the line seemed to be taking its own time, and looking around for some distraction, she suddenly became conscious of a little girl standing on the edge of the marquee. However, if there was a little girl actually there, you'd think that somebody else would have noticed by now that there was an unaccompanied 10-year-old standing next to the theater, but nobody else does. This can also be shown later in the story, when Miriam somehow manages to get to Miller's apartment twice without getting noticed by anyone. This isn't impossible, but it'd be unlikely for nobody to notice that this little girl is just roaming around an apartment complex alone, especially with the large box and doll that she has later in the story. And then there's also the question of how Miriam knew exactly where Miller lived. It would be impossible for her to figure it out because, as Miller mentions, she's not listed in the phone book. When Miller asks, Miriam just dodges the question. In fact, Miriam dodges a lot of questions presented by Miller. This may indicate that Miriam is not real. Another thing that is a bit odd is the old man that appears later in the story. He acts kind of like he knows Miller, smiling at her and tipping his cap at her a bit later. Miriam afterward mentions how she used to live with an old man, which could just be coincidence, or possibly that old man that Miller saw was the one that Miriam lived with, which, under the theory that Miller has schizophrenia, could mean one of two things. One, that Miller saw the old man and included him in her later delusions and hallucinations, or two, that the old man is himself a hallucination by Miller, and that the two hallucinations of Miriam and the old man interconnect. The latter of which is further supported by the dream that Miller had the day before seeing the old man. In it, there was an old man and a crowd of people following a little girl, which could be Miriam. The old man in that dream could be the same old man that Miller saw in the street, which may mean that the first thought of that old man was in the dream, which then manifested later as a hallucination the next day. After seeing the old man, Miller went shopping and happened to get the exact desserts Miriam asked for earlier, which implies that Miller also likes those desserts. This may hint that Miriam and Miller are the same person, and that Miriam is a hallucination of just a different personality that Miller has, something that would be emblematic of dissociative identity disorder, which is often comorbid with schizophrenia. The next time Miriam appears at Miller's apartment, she comes with a package and a doll. The package contains clothes, and Miriam says that she has come to live with Miller. If you can remember, in the story, Miller then asks other people to get Miriam out of her apartment, for some reason being unable to do it herself. A man goes up to Miller's apartment to go find Miriam, however they find no Miriam, nor any package, nor any doll. It seems as if all traces of Miriam existing had disappeared, further showing that Miriam probably isn't real and is just a hallucination by Miller. Only when Miller gets back does Miriam reappear with a single ominous hello. However, the schizophrenia theory does have some gaps. For example, in the story, Miriam broke Miller's vase. If Miriam was not real, how would she destroy a physical thing? You can maybe justify this by saying that Miller destroyed the vase herself and hallucinated Miriam doing it. However, this isn't a particularly strong theory and feels more like fitting the theory to the story rather than making a theory based off the story. There's also some symbolism which may point to a different theory, specifically the canary, which can be said to represent death. About the canary started singing despite the night cover being on, and the story implies that Miriam caused it to, which points that Miriam might not be a hallucination, as she was again interacting with the physical world. These pieces of evidence bring us to One theory is that Miriam represents death coming from Miller, which matches with some of the symbolism in the story. First, as I mentioned previously, there's the canary, which is typically a symbol of death. Miriam has also been associated with the color of white throughout the story, which is also associated with death. Interpreting some of the actual stories through this lens, we get to the dream. In the dream, the little girl can be interpreted as Miriam and as leading people down a hill. The action of leading people down the hill could be understood to mean leading people to death, and the other people following her could be people who are already dead in real life. Among them was the old man, who reappeared the day after she had the dream. The old man, in this theory, can be seen as a ghost or a spirit or something. Some people have said that he could be a family member that Miller does not recognize, however, this is likely not true, as the story reads. She was certain she had never seen him before. After Miller woke up from the dream, she felt sick that day and didn't get up from bed. This could also be a coincidence, but it could allude to the point that Miriam represents death, as usually people will feel sick before they die. Then there's the ending, where Miriam reappears to say hello one final time, right before the story ends. This can be seen as death, since the story ends abruptly. Miriam coming to live with Miller can be portrayed as death coming to Miller. The theory doesn't really explain everything though, like near the beginning where Miller met Miriam and bought her tickets. If Miriam represents death, then what importance does this action have? Maybe you could make some sort of metaphorical justification for that, maybe that the coming of death steals things from you or whatever, but I think that's a bit of a weird metaphor. However, those aren't the only two theories, and another one is that Miriam is a sort of ghost or spirit or other paranormal entity. There's a good amount of evidence to this theory, and a lot of evidence that supports the schizophrenia also carries over to this theory. The theory for this one is that Miriam is some sort of spirit that lives with one person at a time. In the story, we see it in a transition of sorts, as previous host was the old man, and now it's starting to be with Miller. In the schizophrenic theory, it's assumed that Miriam isn't real because nobody else sees her. However, this theory posits that what if Miriam is real, and that she is selective towards who can see her. When Miller first meets Miriam, Miriam is under the marquee alone at the movie theater. Nobody else seems to notice her before Miller does, or if they do, they don't say anything. She then goes up to Miller specifically. It could be hypothesized that there's a reason she's going up to Miller, or maybe this is just her picking a person at random to be our next host. Miriam then asks for a movie ticket, which maybe could be seeing whether or not the person she goes up to is susceptible to her, and Miller buys a ticket for her. There's also Miriam's name, which is the same name as Miller's. Maybe this is a coincidence, or maybe the ghost changes their name corresponding to the person they're trying to latch onto. However, it's impossible to know. Next, if you remember, Miriam shows up in Miller's apartment for the first time. Nothing too much happens here, except of course Miriam stealing things and also smashing that vase. Which, by the way, is one of the things that is against the schizophrenia theory, however it works in favor of this theory. As Miriam is a ghost or supernatural entity or whatever, it makes sense that she could interact with the physical world. In this interaction, Miriam also asks for two specific desserts, cherries and almond cakes. Miller decides to go shopping later, and she happens to get those desserts. In the schizophrenia theory, this was viewed as a piece of evidence showing that Miriam and Miller are the same person. However, in this theory, this might show that Miriam has some sort of power to influence Miller's thought and decisions. You can also see her using this power when she steals Miller's jewel, as for some reason Miller is unable to stop a 10-year-old child from stealing things. There's also the dream, where we see the little girl, possibly Miriam, leading all the people down the hill. This dream could have been Miriam influencing Miller's thoughts, and is also where we see the first mention of the old man. The old man reappears when Miller goes shopping, and since Miriam later mentions previously having lived with an old man, under this theory, the old man is viewed as the last person Miriam lived with. The old man could be dead, and Miriam could be making him appear in Miller's head, however it can't be known if that's true. When Miller returns to her apartment, Miriam comes back, stating that she now wishes to live with Miller, bringing her stuff home. Miller exits the room and tries to get other people to get Miriam out of her apartment, which she can't seem to do herself. The fact that she's unable to do it herself also shows the power that Miriam appears to have again, that despite Miller being physically able to do something, she is unable to because Miriam stops her from doing it. So instead of getting Miriam out directly, Miller tries to get other people to go up there and do it for her. However, when they go up, Miriam is not seen. There's more evidence towards how she selectively picks who can notice her. Miller seems to be able to see her just fine, however when other people go to where Miriam is, they can't seem to find her. Then there's the ending, where Miller begins to lose her touch on reality and tries to regain her hold on things by confirming her identity. Cool. For the only thing she had lost to Miriam was her identity, but now she knew she had found again the person who lived in this room, who cooked her own meals, who owned the canary, who was someone she could trust and believe in, Mrs. H.T. Miller. Then Miller hears a sound, the opening of a drawer, and eventually we're left with a single haunting hello from Miriam. The story then ends. So how could this be interpreted in our paranormal theory? Well, maybe it's Miriam kind of getting her final grips on Miller's mind. Perhaps Miriam is some sort of parasite, taking control of a person to do God knows what. This would explain why Miller felt she had lost her identity to Miriam. That was the goal. Miriam could be trying to invade Miller's thoughts, replacing them with her own. This could also explain why she appeared in her dreams. After all, dreams are just an extension of her subconscious. This theory, however, still isn't perfect. It kind of reduces the story to another sort of paranormal horror thing, but with the way the story is written, it feels like more than that. I'd recommend reading the story yourself to see what I mean, because my summary doesn't do it justice. The story, as Robert J. Stanton puts it, has a dreamlike psychological quality, which you can only really get if you read the story yourself. So, what's the point of analyzing stories this much? Doesn't it just kind of detract from the purpose of the story by adding a new superficial analytical layer on top of it? Well, hypothetical viewer, yes, sometimes over-analysis is bad, but a lot of the time analysis is a way to gain deeper insights into the stories we all know and love. It can expand upon the original story and show things that aren't exactly obvious on the first read-through. So why did I make this analysis? What insight did I give into this story that you wouldn't have thought otherwise? Well, ignoring the fact that this was a project for English class, I think my analysis helps point out that there isn't always one correct interpretation of a text. It shows multiple interpretations, what they mean, what they don't, and how the same event in the text can be seen in different ways depending on the frame of reference you use. So with that said, what is Miriam about? Well, many things. Or instead of saying the story is about many things, I think it's more helpful to say that the story can be about many things. It can be about schizophrenia, or it can be about death, or it can be about a ghost of spirit, it can be about losing your mind and slowly going crazy, it can be about all these things, or hell, it can be about none of them. It's really up to the individual to decide, which is one of the things I like about literature. It will always stay the same to everyone, but each individual person puts their own meaning into it based on their own personal experiences. In some way, every piece of literature is personalized. Everyone gets different messages from the same story. And while they may be similar or overlap in different ways, your own interpretation is unique to you and yourself only, which I think is pretty neat.